This program is brought to you by RTS on iTunes U from the Distance Education Department of Reformed Theological Seminary. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.
All right, the next topic, on page 37, we begin a new era. We begin a new period of philosophy. I call it early modern philosophy. We'll say this is from 1650 to 1800. Of course, those dates are a little bit arbitrary. During this period, there are two very distinct traditions that develop. There's one group called the Rationalists and another group called the Empiricists. Rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. Empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. And this line between them is the English Channel, okay? The rationalist tradition takes its root on the continent of Europe. Descartes is French, Spinoza is a Portuguese-Dutch Jew, and Leibniz is German. And here Locke, Berkeley, and Hume are all Britishers. So there's a divide in the philosophical community. And there's also a systematic divide, a content divide. The Continental rationalists believe that this is all a contest between reason and the senses. The senses are the eyes, the ears, the nose. The senses take in the data. Remember, Aristotle put a great emphasis on knowledge through the senses. The reason is what's in the head. The reason is what takes the sense data and shapes it so that we understand it, so that we have ideas about it. And that reason is what is emphasized by Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Now, of course, they all believe that we get some knowledge through the senses and that we shape that knowledge through the reason. But they each group tended to be a little skeptical about the other. These rationalists tended to say that the empiricists, the senses are not very reliable. The empiricists tended to say that the rationalists are kind of speculative, that their reason takes them into wild frenzies. So these two traditions, later on, we'll see how they come together in Immanuel Kant. That'll be quite a ways from today. But anyway, the rationalist tradition and the empiricist tradition. Now I know what I was trying to remember. I've used the word rationalist to you in a much broader way so far in the course. I indicated to you that when human beings sinned, they began to try to think autonomously, and that led to rationalism and irrationalism. Rationalism thinking that the mind is capable of being the ultimate standard of truth. Irrationalism denying that there's any knowledge at all. Now, rationalism and irrationalism, that played back and forth. The sophists being irrationalists, Plato being a rationalist. And but here, I'm using the term rationalist in a little different way. Here, I'm not using it so much in contrast with irrationalism as I am in contrast with empiricism. And this is a somewhat different use of the term. Here, the issue is not whether my mind is capable of knowing the truth and whether the mind should be foremost, but here it's whether the brain, whether the mind is the final criterion or the senses are. here it's mind versus senses. Here it's, but in what I told you before, it was the rationalism versus the irrationalism. Here it's not so much rationalism versus irrationalism, although the empiricists tended to be more on the irrationalist side. The distinction I gave you before is not exactly the same as this one, but it's kind of similar to this one. Anyway, you need to get aware of the difference between some thinkers, which are primarily trusting reason, other thinkers who primarily trust their sense experience. So you see, under Continental Rationalism comes from the tradition of Parmenides and Plato, but 1650 to 1800, there's more mathematical and logical sophistication. Also, something of a new arrogance. Now remember when I told you that back in 600 BC, Greek philosophy got started as some thinkers decided to rebel against their religious traditions and to try to understand the world not through religion, but through reason alone. Now, something very similar happens around 1650, where these philosophers are setting aside the whole tradition of medieval and Reformation theology and philosophy. Remember, during the medieval period, it was Christianity that dominated. Christianity was dominant in the thought of Augustine and even Origena and Dionysius, although they had a lot of Neoplatonism in their system. Anselm, Aquinas, Bonaventure, Occam, and all these guys are Christians. And they're all trying to integrate philosophy with their Christian faith. What happens in the 1600s, though, is that a new group of philosophers decide they don't want to reason according to religious tradition anymore. Just like the Milesian Greek philosophers, they want to push that religious tradition aside, push that behind them, and reason according to, and get to know the world according to their own reason. Well, the Continental Rationalists distrust their sense experience. The senses, they say, deceive us. The stick in the water appears to be bent, but it turns out, if you look at it more closely, it turns out that it's really straight. Well, so the senses deceive us. There are all kinds of optical illusions. Now, what is it that corrects the senses? Well, what corrects the senses is reason. You look there in the river, and you see a stick that looks bent, and you say to yourself, well, I know my eyes tell me that it's bent, but my mind tells me that it's really straight, because I make allowance. In my mind and my reasoning, I make allowance for that bending of light rays that takes place. So, reason is a higher source of certainty than the senses are. And so the idea is that reason must have access to a knowledge that's not available to the senses. The goal of Continental Rationalist philosophy is the mathematical model. See, mathematics is the best example of a system, a body of knowledge that's gained from reason alone. I mean, 2 plus 2 is 4. You don't need to go into the backyard to find out if that's true. Your reason does that. You just think that, and you know that it's true. And so with most mathematical propositions, you know that it's true just by thinking about them. And what the rationalists try to do, or their great dream at least, is to reduce all human knowledge to mathematical systems. If they can only get all of human knowledge into something like Euclid's geometry, where you have self-evident axioms and you deduce all the rest of the content from those axioms by logical means. So you try to develop purely rational science and philosophy, of course, unhindered by divine revelation. These rationalists, then, as I say, they are rationalists in a narrower sense, but they're also rationalists in the broader sense. Just as Plato was more of a rationalist than an irrationalist, so Descartes is more of a rationalist than an irrationalist. He's aware of the powers of reason much more than he is aware of the limitations of reason. Well, let's look at Descartes a little bit. Descartes tells the typical tale of the time. I sought for the truth, and I looked here and I looked there, and this person said something and this person disagreed, and I just didn't know what to do. So I resolved to doubt everything that I could possibly doubt. Okay? He resolves to doubt everything except what he clearly and distinctly perceives to be true. All right? And that's not easy. You have to doubt all your childhood upbringing, everything that your father and mother have said to you. What do they know? So you can doubt that. And everything that you can doubt, you do doubt. Traditional theology, what the priest says. No, you can't be sure about that. That's not something you clearly and distinctly perceive to be true, so you just jettison all these things. And just think, what is it that I clearly and distinctly perceive to be true? Is there anything of which I am absolutely sure? And that's the goal, to find something that's absolutely sure, something that I can't doubt, something that will be a foundation for all my other thinking. And what can that be? Well, what it turns out to be for Descartes is his own existence. He can't doubt his own existence. Why? Well, because he can't doubt that he's doubting. He can't doubt that he's thinking. Doubting presupposes a doubter. And so, I doubt, therefore I exist. Dubito ergo sum. Also, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Or je pense donc je suis. He wrote it in French too. So I think, therefore I am. He starts off with his own thought. This is the most fundamental presupposition. The thinking man. The thinking consciousness. This is the ultimate presupposition. Not God, not Christ, not the church, not a confession somewhere, not the Bible. The fundamental presupposition is that I am a thinking being and that I perceive my own thought, and since my thought exists, therefore I exist. Now, it's not that he denies God. In fact, once he has established his own existence, then he believes he's able to prove God's existence. And he uses various ontological and cosmological arguments, beginning with the fact that he has an idea of God in his mind. See, the focal point is himself. He has an idea of God in his mind, and only a God existing outside the mind is sufficient to cause that idea in the mind. So, God, I think, therefore I exist, therefore God exists, okay? God is not the foundation of my thinking. God is not the presupposition, but God comes in later as an implication of what I believe. Well, look a little bit more at the human self. The human self, we know it exists first of all. What is the self? Well, the self is a thinking being, because I perceive, that's how I know the self exists, because I'm aware of its thought. So what the self does is it thinks. And Descartes believes that there are two basic properties in the world. thought and extension. Our thoughts don't have extension, all right? Extension would be like length or width or weight or something like that. Thoughts don't have that. I mean, you have a thought of your own name. Well, how long is that? How much does it weigh? How much does your thought? How long is your thought? Is your thought triangular? Is it spherical? What is it? Well, that's of course nonsense. Thoughts don't have any extension. Further extension, extended things would be like material things, like tables and chairs and stuff. And extended things don't have any thought. You know, here's a table that's 6 feet long, let's say. Is that length true or false? Is it witty? Is it insightful? No. Extended objects don't have the properties of thought, and thoughts don't have the properties of extended objects. So this is a fundamental metaphysical distinction. Thought and extension are absolutely distinct, absolutely different. Thoughts don't have extension, extensions don't have thoughts. So Descartes says that the self is a thinking being and therefore it must be unextended. Okay? What I am is thought. What I am most essentially is thought. I'm a thinking being and therefore I am not an extended being. I am not a material being. But my body is an extended being. And my body does not think. No, the mind is in the body. But the mind has totally different properties from the body. Gilbert Ryle later on described Descartes' view as the ghost in the machine. Have you ever heard of that? Descartes' idea is that the mind is like a ghost. It can have no effect on the body. Thoughts can have no effect on extended things because the thoughts can't push them around. You need to have extension if you're going to affect extension. And the thought can't do that. The thought is entirely different. Furthermore, the extension cannot influence my thoughts. So, the two are totally apart from one another. And this is really, I mean, the Greeks wrestled with this a little bit too, but this really exaggerates what has sometimes been called the mind-body problem. That is, how can the mind influence the body, and how can the body influence the mind? Now, Aristotle thought the mind was the form of the body, and so he brought them together very closely. But Plato had this problem, you know, how the mind is a soul that's fallen from the world of forms and gotten trapped in a body. Well, Descartes here is very close to Plato. Descartes has this mind that's totally separate from the body, and so how can the mind have any effect on the body? It's a mystery. How is it that when my mind decides to lift up my arm, the arm goes up? I mean, it's almost magical. So the influence of mind and body is impossible in Descartes' philosophy, and yet, now here's a philosophical joke. Descartes says, the mind cannot affect the body at all, but there's this one place in the body, the pineal gland. And in Descartes' time, nobody knew what the pineal gland was for. So Descartes says, hey, maybe that's the one place where the mind bumps up against the body, all right? There's a little bit of influence of the mind upon the body. And the mind just gives it a tiny little nudge, and that nudge leads to greater nudges, and eventually my hand goes up like that. Now that's a philosophical joke, because that's ridiculous. I mean, if the mind has no extension, so that the mind is unable to have any influence on the body at all, how can you fudge it like that and say, yeah, but it can have just a little tiny bit? You know, that's like somebody saying she's a little bit pregnant, either you're pregnant or you're not. I mean, either the mind can affect the body or it can't. But Descartes fudges, and so the pineal gland is a great old philosophical joke. The body is subject to purely mechanical explanation, while the mind is free from causal determination. You see what happens to free will here? Descartes is kind of like the modern scientists who say everything is mechanical. Everything has a mechanical explanation. There's one motion that's got to be caused by another motion and so on. Determinism. Well, what happens then to free will? And some people would say, Spinoza says there is no free will. But Descartes says, determinism in the world of matter, but free will in the area of mind, okay? Mind is completely free from the causal influence of material objects. So Descartes has both free will and determinism. Now we come to Baruch Spinoza. You sometimes hear Benedict Spinoza. Benedict means blessed in Latin. Baruch means blessed in Hebrew. And Spinoza was a Jew, and he lived in Portugal and was expelled with other Jews to the Netherlands. Spinoza is an interesting figure. He is very much a modern man, very, very much a rationalist, but also a kind of biblical scholar, and we're going to see later on Spinoza is one who gets the tradition of liberal theology moving. But for now, let's just think of Spinoza as a rationalist. Spinoza tries to do what Descartes had hoped to do. Descartes had hoped to get all human knowledge gathered in terms of a geometrical system. Spinoza actually tries to do it. Spinoza's first book is called The Philosophy of Descartes Demonstrated Geometrically. And then later on, he wrote this book called Ethics, and the whole title is Ethics More Geometrico Demonstrando, ethics demonstrated by a geometrical method. And in these books, Spinoza begins with axioms, which are supposed to be self-evidently true. And then from those axioms, you deduce logically propositions and lemmas and corollaries and all the things that you would find in a Euclidean geometry, or a non-Euclidean geometry for that matter. So he uses a geometrical method and develops his system that way. In the process of this, he eliminates what he considers to be irrationalist elements of Descartes. In the system of Spinoza, everything follows rigorously, and that doesn't leave any room for free will. And that doesn't leave any room for mind-body dualism. There's only one substance. Now remember the word substance. Substance is that which that which exists in itself. Aristotle defined the word substance. Substance is what can take the subject position in a sentence, for example. Substance and attribute. Spinoza defines it with a little bit of a rationalistic twist. Spinoza says a substance is that which exists in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, it's something that exists on its own. It can be the subject of a sentence. And if I want to know about it, it kind of reveals itself to me. It has all the information within it that I need to gain knowledge of it. So, what is the substance then? Can I know the table entirely through itself? No. In order to understand the table, I need to know who manufactured it. I need to know the function that it serves in this room. So Spinoza is one of these people who says that the way to comprehensive knowledge is context. I know this by knowing its history, by knowing its present context, by knowing its future, and that means by knowing all its relationships to everything else, ultimately its relationships to everything else in the universe. And so there's really only one thing that's completely self-explanatory, and that is the universe. The only thing that can really be known is the universe. There is only one substance, the universe. And that universe has two names. You can call it nature, or you can call it God. And that universe is one. It's without generation, without destruction. It exists eternally, and so on and so forth. It's kind of similar to Parmenidean being. This idea is kind of similar to criticisms that are made against Parmenides. It's very similar to Hegel, which we'll talk about later on. But you see, Spinoza believes that is kind of a pantheist. He believes that the whole universe constitutes a self-sufficient being, which you can call God or you can call nature, and you can prove all of this by mathematical means. Now, the third of the Continental rationalists is G.W. Leibniz, and you see his dates there. Leibniz is an atomistic idealist. Now, you should be getting these terms. These are important terms. Spinoza is a monist. He believes that there's only one thing. And as a monist, he's like Parmenides. Leibniz is not a monist. Leibniz believes that there are many, many things. There are two ways. I think I've told you this before, maybe. There are two ways to get knowledge of the whole universe. You can either do what Spinoza does and say that to know the table, I've got to know its relationship to this and that, and its relationship to the past, and its relationship to the future, ultimately its relationship to the whole universe. So you know one thing by investigating its relationships to all the other things. The other way to try to seek comprehensive knowledge is by chopping things up. Not getting bigger, not trying to get to know everything in the context of the whole universe, but by getting smaller, chopping this table into parts, and chopping those parts into smaller parts, and smaller parts, and smaller parts, and when you get done, what you've got is something that can't be chopped anymore, and you know, and that then is one of the ultimate constituents of the universe. Okay? Remember that among the Greeks you have people like Democritus, and you have Epicurus who took this position. They became atomists. They chopped everything up and then described the behavior of the atomists, atoms, as they understood them. Well, Leibniz does this. He divides the world into tiny, invisible entities. Now, what happens when you chop everything down and you get something that can't be chopped any longer? What do you call it? It's not matter, because matter, by its very definition, can be chopped, can be cut in half. What is it that can't be cut in half? Is there anything that can't be cut in half when you reach these tiny little things that are too small to chop anymore, so that they're the ultimate constituents of the world, and they can't be cut any longer? What do you call that? When you've got all the extension down to zero, so you can't cut anymore, what have you got? Well, you've got thought. You've got mind. See, Leibniz is still operating in the same general area as Descartes. There's thought and there's extension. And thought is not extended and extension is not thoughtful. So when you get to something that's no longer extended, it's thought. So the atoms are not little bits of matter the way Democritus thought. The atoms, an atom means can't be chopped, The atoms are mind-like. Each atom thinks. Now that's kind of weird, isn't it? The tiniest little things that build up, that make up the whole world. In this table, there's zillions of tiny little minds. Leibniz is sometimes called a panpsychist. Spinoza was a pantheist. A panpsychist is somebody who believes that everything is mind. Another word for this is idealist. An idealist is somebody who believes that everything is mental, that matter reduces to mind. We'll see other examples of that as we move along. So for Leibniz, these mind-like entities, each one develops according to his own internal laws, because of course nothing material can affect a mind. Organisms, now what about people? What about animals? Well, organisms like you and me are made up of lots of these little things. There are lots of little minds in my fingers and my arms and all of this. But there's also a big mind in my head. And this mind is the mind that directs all the other minds. And that's what Leibniz sometimes calls the queen monad, the soul. And with that soul, or that mind, or that queen monad, all the other monads, all monads of my fingers and my toes and my legs and so on, all of those work in harmony. Not so much that the mind controls all of those, but that they're somehow pre-programmed. That when my mind says, hey, I'd like to move my arm, the monads in my arm move. And it's not that I'm making that happen. It's not that my mind is making my arm happen. But rather somebody has pre-programmed my mind and pre-programmed my arm so that they work together. Kind of a remarkable thing that happens there. Who has programmed them? Well, probably God. There's a little bit of an ambiguity here in Leibniz's writings. But anyway, he does believe in God. God is kind of like the supreme monad of the universe. Does God control all the other monads? Well, it's hard to tell. In some of Leibniz's writings, it seems that he does. God is the one who's programmed everything to act as it does. Perhaps, though, he's more like a deist. He created the world and left it to operate according to the internal laws of the monads. Or perhaps he created the world, or maybe not. Maybe the harmony between the monads is just kind of accidental. Maybe that's just the way things are, and God sort of fits into that. I don't know, a little hard to understand just what Leibniz is making of this. Anyway, you can imagine that when somebody comes along and says that tables and chairs and trees and human bodies are made up of these little tiny minds, some people are going to say, hey, that's nuts. That's a little speculative, Leibniz. So there's a movement here to try to get back down to earth, to move away from speculation. Now, you think the reason is reliable while the senses are unreliable, but that's not right. I mean, the reason can get speculative, it can get weird, it can go way off the beaten track. So there's some people say if you really want to know the world, you got to get back to the bedrock. You got to get back to what's obvious. You need to get back to the senses. You need to get back to what you see and what you hear. And those people are called empiricists. The empirical has to do with experience. And let's get back to sense experience instead of going off on these speculative fantasies. Let's get back to sense experience. And so that is the movement called Empiricism. Usually, for the most part, in Great Britain, across the English Channel. In general, British empiricism is closer to Aristotle than to Plato, opposite to the rationalists, the Continental rationalists, in that the empiricists distrust the speculations of reason and insist that all ideas be firmly grounded in sense experience. Now, what this turns out to be, if you follow this movement from Locke to Berkeley to Hume, it becomes more and more skeptical, okay? Because it's true what the rationalists say, you can't always trust your senses. So there's always room for doubt. I mean, even Locke said that you can't know anything with absolute certainty on the basis of your senses. So you begin by saying, well, we can't be absolutely certain, and you end up, after Hume, saying we can't really know anything much. Tendency towards skepticism, then, especially in Hume, who was the most consistent of the empiricists. A Christian philosophy, I think, will reject both rationalism and empiricism, for on a Christian basis, neither autonomous reason nor autonomous sense experience is suitable as an ultimate basis of thought. Okay, the first of these, John Locke. Isn't it interesting that philosophical movements tend to have three members? Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, the three idealists, Peirce, James, and Dewey, the three pragmatists, Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud, the three illusionists. Of course, I deal with threes a lot, and so people sometimes ask me to line them up with my triangles, and I can't really. But anyway, it's kind of interesting to me that sometimes, two is not quite enough and four is too many, and so even philosophical movements tend to deal with threes. Well, John Locke first. John Locke believes, contrary to Plato and contrary to Augustine, that there are no innate ideas in the mind. Okay, Plato and Augustine seem to think that there are ideas planted from birth, planted from conception in the mind, or at least some kind of mechanism by which ideas develop very shortly after birth. Locke says no. His metaphor is that the mind is a blank slate, tabula rasa. We emerge from birth, from conception maybe, with no knowledge at all. And the knowledge we have is imprinted by experience. Okay? We see this, and we hear that, and we see a color, and we hear a sound. And eventually all of these come together and produce knowledge. In the process of empirical knowledge, there is no absolute certainty, only degrees of probability. Locke did profess to be a Christian, and people sometimes asked him, do you believe that knowledge can come from divine revelation? And he said, well, yes, divine revelation may communicate truths which could not be discovered by reason alone. But the truth of a revelation can never be as certain as the principles of reason. Now remember, Locke puts more stock in the senses than he does in reason, but he's reasonable about reason, right? He thinks that the whole process of knowledge can be called reason, and he believes that when you do that right, you can come to knowledge. Well, you can get knowledge through revelation too, but you can't get as much knowledge through revelation as you can get through reason. Locke has a common sense metaphysic. You have mind, you have matter, you have God, but he's not as rigorous as Descartes in saying that mind and matter are absolutely contrary to one another. He just believes that God operates in a somewhat way that Protestants have understood him to operate. He doesn't endorse free will in the sense of autexousion, in the sense of libertarianism, but he believes the person has the freedom to make choices. So in this sense, he's kind of similar to Calvinists, what's sometimes called the compatibilist position of Calvinism, that is a view of freedom that's compatible with determinism. Now, the second of the empiricists is George Berkeley. I say George Berkeley because my teacher said George Berkeley, but there's some people, especially people who come from California, who say Berkeley. Well, Berkeley was a bishop of the church in those dates that you can see there. And Berkeley carried the argument of Locke one step further. Locke said there are no innate ideas. Berkeley says there are no abstract ideas. Now, you remember that this is getting into the controversy between realism and nominalism. The realists, following Plato, thought that our ideas are basically abstract. Courage, beauty, manhood, houseness, treeness. Basically, our ideas are ideas of abstractions. And Plato thought that those abstractions have more reality than any idea of particular things. But Berkeley says there are no abstract ideas. I mean, try to think of house in general. Now, you may think of your own house. Your own house is red with white trim, perhaps. But try to think of house in general. What color is that house? So you really don't have ideas of generalities. You don't have ideas of abstractions. And Berkeley, therefore, puts himself in with the nominalists rather than the realists. Furthermore, Berkeley believes that our knowledge is limited to our own ideas. Okay, we know only our own ideas. The quality of an idea, and Berkeley is still an empiricist, our ideas consist of perceptions, okay? And perception is not just a sense datum. Perception is the sense datum brought into the mind and understood, where I say I perceive a chair or I perceive the sun. So we have that perception, and Berkeley says to be is to be perceived. Okay? We know only our ideas. So far as we know, it's only our ideas, it's only our perceptions that exist. To know is to know your ideas, and for something to be is to be perceived. If I say that a tree exists, what do I mean by that? I mean that somebody somewhere is perceiving that tree. Okay? So for the tree to be is to be perceived. If nobody perceives it, it doesn't exist. That's the old saying, you know, if the tree falls in the forest, did it really fall? And nobody sees it. Nobody hears it. Nobody knows about it. If the tree falls in the forest, does it really fall in the forest? And Berkeley would say no. If there's nobody perceiving it, there's no reality either. So esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. This means that there's no such thing as material substance which exists apart from mind. Now, you remember for Descartes, there are two types of substances. There are thinking substances and there are extended substances. Okay? And they're totally opposite to one another. Thinking substances are not extended. Extended substances are not thinking. So what Berkeley does is he says there is no such thing as an extended substance. The only substances are mental substances. The only things that exist are the contents of mind. The only things that exist are perceptions. So there is no material substance existing independently of mind. Everything that there is exists in some mind or other. All reality is mental in character. What's the technical name for that? Idealism. Okay? The idealist is the one who believes that everything is mental. Everything consists of ideas. Who's the last idealist that we talked about? Leibniz. Leibniz, who believes that the world consists entirely of little tiny minds. So Leibniz is an atomistic idealist, but Berkeley is an idealist empiricist. He believes that all reality is mental in character. So it's all in the mind. Well, if it's all in the mind, why is it that I can't control it all? You know, I can control what's in my mind, right? I mean, I'm thinking now of a triangle, okay? And now I'm deciding to think about something else. I'm thinking of a chair. And when I thought about that chair for a moment, I wasn't thinking about the triangle. So usually when you're talking about the contents of your mind, you're talking about something you can control. But look, I mean, Berkeley is saying that everything is in the mind. The walls are in the mind. The clock is in the mind. The trees are in the mind. Everything is in the mind. I don't have control of those. I see a truck coming, and I say, "Stop, truck," in my mind, and the truck keeps coming at me. I don't have control of that truck. So what is it that makes these things happen? Why? There's a progression there's a drama, there's a narrative here. There are things that come at me, and there are things that go away from me. I don't have control of that. Who has control of it? And Berkeley's answer is God. This drama that I experience, it's written by God. Okay? God is the one who imprints these ideas on my mind in regular order. Okay? So that everything that happens to me is governed by God's reality. Well, I don't know what you make of that. I mean, I promised you that the empiricists were trying to get away from weird stuff and get into common sense. That's kind of true with Locke. I mean, Locke is a very common sense thinker. Berkeley, you might think, is getting a little weird. Everything is in the mind, huh? But Berkeley would say, you know, this saves us from having to make certain distinctions. I mean, Locke had this idea that when I look at a tree, I have to distinguish between the primary and the secondary qualities. The hardness, the extension of the tree, that's a primary quality. But the colors and the smells of the tree, those are secondary qualities. The primary qualities are in the tree itself. The secondary qualities are in my mind. Now, that's a neat trick to make that distinction. And how do you distinguish between the properties, the primary qualities and the secondary qualities? Berkeley says you don't have to make that distinction. These qualities are all in the same place. The hardness of the tree and the greenness of the tree both pertain equally to the tree, okay, and equally to the mind, all right? So Berkeley would say, really, his view is more common sense than Locke, because the greenness, common sense says that the greenness is part of the tree, and that's what Berkeley's philosophy says. You don't have to make a distinction between what the mind perceives and what is really out there. You don't have to make a distinction between the pretty colored world that we've experienced and the gray, featureless reality out there. No, everything is in the mind. Everything is beautiful. All the shapes and sounds and odors and everything comes into the mind at God's bequest. Let's move on to number 4, David Hume. David Hume, the chief skeptic of the modern period. Everybody is trying to find a way to escape from being such a skeptic as David Hume. Everybody, after David Hume, everybody is terribly afraid that we're going to lose knowledge entirely. We won't be able to find any truth at all. We won't be able to get any truth in science or theology or ethics or anything. So how can we possibly escape the skepticism of Hume? Well, let's talk about the skepticism of Hume. Tremendously important figure. Now, Hume takes a step beyond Locke, a step beyond Berkeley. Locke said there are no innate ideas. Berkeley said there are no general ideas. Locke said there are two kinds of substances, the mental substance and the physical substance. Berkeley said no, there's only one kind of substance, and that's mental substance. Hume goes still beyond that. Hume says there is no substance at all. There is no reason to believe that there is either mental substance or material substance. Just be an empiricist for a moment. Look out in the world. Watch with your eyes. What do you see? Well, you see tables and chairs and stuff like that. You see people. You see clock. So I don't see substances out there. I don't see physical substances. In the sense of Locke and the sense of Aristotle. And I can understand Berkeley's argument that maybe they're just all part of my mind. They're not substantive. They're just part of my mind. But do I see the mind? And Hume says, look, I'm looking out there and I see tables and chairs. What I don't see is my own mind. I don't see myself. I don't see my soul. I don't see thoughts. And so I don't see any physical substance and I don't see any mental substance either. What then is personal identity? What am I? Where am me? And remember, we have to be empiricists here. Everything we know has to come through sense experience. I don't see me. I don't see my soul. That's a pretty serious problem. So, what do I say about personal identity? Well, Hume says we can use the term soul to indicate a certain bundle of perceptions. Okay? I don't see me, I see the perceptions. And my bundle of perceptions is different from somebody else's, I presume. So when I talk about myself, what I mean is the bundle of perceptions that I'm having and that I have had down through the years. So Hume is skeptical about personal identity. He's skeptical about the existence of the soul. B, he is also skeptical about cause and effect. Now remember how important cause and effect was to Thomas Aquinas, all right? How he emphasized cause in trying to prove the existence of God. And, of course, everybody who's written on philosophy of science, with the rise of modern science, causality becomes all the more important. That's what the scientists are trying to learn about, causality. What is the cause of this? What is the cause of that? Now, Hume says There's really a problem with the whole idea of cause. Look at billiard balls, all right? When we talk about causes, we're always talking about billiard balls, all right? So here we have a series of billiard balls. This one moves this one moves this one. So what do you actually see in this sequence? You see this one moving, and this one, and it hits this one, and then this one moves. So we say this one is the cause and this one is the effect, all right? And then this becomes the cause and this becomes the effect. Well, what do we see here? We see that this touches this one, so closeness, contiguity, priority. This one comes before this one. This one is moving before this one. And then they come into closeness, and then this one moves. Is that all there is to causality? Contiguity and priority? What a lot of people, and I think Thomas Aquinas would want to say this, what a lot of people want to add here is necessary connection. In other words, when this one moves, not only does this one move, but this one has to move. Okay? This one makes this one move. This one forces this one to move. Necessary connection. But Hume says, wait a minute, I'm an empiricist. I'm restricted to what my eyes tell me. And my eyes here tell me, yeah, I see the contiguity. Yes, I see the priority. But I don't see any necessary connection. I don't see any necessity. I see that the second billiard ball moves, but I don't see that it has to move. I don't see that it necessarily moves. Necessity is not something that I can see. So what Hume says is that we don't experience necessary connection. We only have contiguity, priority, and, to be fair, a habit. That is, when we see motions like this, we are in the habit of expecting motions like this. Okay? Psychological, a matter of habit, a matter of custom. So what we thought of as necessary connection really turns out to be something psychological. It turns out to be something within us, just a pattern of expectation. Now, Hume is not against this. I mean, people sometimes say that Hume destroyed causality. Well, Hume wouldn't say that. Hume would say that he's just explaining what causality is. For Hume, the causality is important. And Hume thinks it's absolutely necessary, well, I hate to use that term again, it's necessary for science. If we don't have causality, we can't do science. And at one place, Hume presents himself as a determinist, and he says he can't imagine that anything would ever happen without a cause. So, but when he says that, what he means is contiguity, priority, and a habit and custom of expecting something to happen after something else happens. So he claims to be a very strong believer in causality, even a determinist. But a lot of people have thought that Hume took the guts out of the concept of causality. Well, we've talked about mental substance. We've talked about cause and effect. C, there is no certainty in knowledge. And if there's no necessity in causality, you never know what will happen, right? Well, in a way you do, because you're expecting it to. But vast uncertainty here. But in order to live, we must assume certain things about causes, and we must act on the basis of our causal expectations. So there's no determinism in Spinoza's sense, but no free will either, since we must act on causal expectations even with respect to human actions. Now, Hume is skeptical about a lot of other things. For example, and I'm not sure why I didn't mention it here, but there's his famous essay on miracles, which is part of the essay concerning human understanding. Hume here basically says, he uses a lot of arguments against miracles, but his strongest argument, and the most central argument, is this: that it's impossible to get sufficient testimony to establish that a miracle has happened. It's an argument about testimony, because after all, we have seen so many things happen with natural explanations that it would take an awful lot of evidence to believe that something happened miraculously, that is, without a natural explanation. And where you have testimony, you say to yourself, well, it's more likely that these people are lying, or that they're deceived, or that they're misled, or that they were honestly wrong. It's much more likely that they are misled than like a miraculous event would take place. So miraculous events are so improbable that you can't really believe any testimony. There just is no testimony that's sufficient to establish that a miracle has taken place. So, in those days, people thought that the basis for believing in Christianity was the miracles. And Hume says, no, you can't really prove that anything happened by way of miracles. But occasionally, now what he says is, it's not that he's saying that miracles are impossible. He's just saying that it's so difficult to get any kind of testimony for them. But occasionally he tips his hand, and he says the reason why there's such a shortage of testimony is that miracles are inherently improbable. In fact, inherently impossible. I forget exactly the language that he uses. But it's pretty clear that in his account, including his account of testimony, including his account of probability, that he's stacking the deck. He's beginning with the presupposition that miracles don't happen. For one thing, of course, he gives absolutely no credence to revelation. He gives no credence to the idea that God might come to us and show us that miracles have taken place. So he simply starts off with very naturalistic presuppositions, and in that argument he uses that to prove that miracles have taken place, which really ought to do it the other way around. And he's also critical of the theistic proofs, especially the teleological argument, the argument for design. And you can read that for yourself. It's basically, he says that where you think there's been a design, there are usually other explanations. One of the most famous of these is that when he says that well, maybe there's evidence of design in the planets, and there's evidence of design in the plants, and there's evidence of design in the human eye, and so on and so forth. Well, maybe there are a whole lot of different gods, one of them being in charge of the human eye, one of them being in charge of the planets, one of them being in charge of something else. Or he says things like maybe there are other reasons why things appear to act in an orderly way. Maybe the universe is a giant vegetable. So he posits alternative hypotheses and so on. And it's all very interesting, and it's all very skeptical, and it persuades a lot of people. But to me, all of this shows that the Christian, if the Christian is going to understand the Bible and understand the Christian worldview, he's going to have to do it on the basis of a biblical view of epistemology, a biblical view of knowing, a biblical view of testimony, a biblical view of our knowledge equipment. And Hume, of course, doesn't even give that consideration. Well, this is the most consistent form of empiricism that there is. He sets a pattern. We're going to see Christian thinkers reacting against Hume. We're going to see secular thinkers reacting against Hume. Hume is the one now that everybody has to answer. He's the one that everybody has to refute. And we'll see how everybody tries to do that as we move on.
The preceding program has been brought to you by RTS on iTunes U and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.